Ladies and gentlemen, a very nice good morning. Welcome to the morning session of today. I have first to announce a little changement you have been maybe informed about already. Unfortunately, our colleague Lea Wohl von Haselberg from Berlin is not able to participate today. Instead, we'll have the pleasure to listen to the lecture of two colleagues from Belgrade, Mrs. Nevena Daković and Aleksandra Milovanović. Milovanović, I'm sorry. Both these colleagues will speak about Holocaust, war, and memories. It's that lecture you find on our previous program on Saturday morning, but since one of the dear colleagues, unfortunately for familiar reason, has to leave earlier, so we will listen to this lecture today, but you will have the possibility to discuss to this topic again on Saturday morning if you would like to. So today we start with a very interesting topic, which is going to be presented by our German colleague Jan Taubitz. Mr. Taubitz is working at Haus der Geschichte der Bundesrepublik Deutschland in Berlin. And he will talk about the emplotment of survival in early American television and survivors' testimonies. May I ask you, Mr. Taubitz, to take the chair?
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and I want also to thank the VWI for having me. It's an honor. In 1953, the entire life history of a Holocaust survivor was presented for the first time on American television. I'm going to discuss this by now iconic TV event, and I'm going to show that surprisingly it anticipated central elements that today seem to be generic for videotape testimonies of survivors which are created since the late 1970s. My argument is that television invented the emplotment of these testimonies. Therefore, television is not the antithesis of authentic survivors' testimonies, but a crucial part of its advancement. But first things first. The Holocaust survivor, whose life story was presented in 1953, was born as Hanna Bloch in Sudetenland in 1919. After the German invasion, she fled to Amsterdam. In winter 1943, she was arrested in her hideout and deported to Westerbork, from there to Theresienstadt and finally to Auschwitz. After her liberation in Mauthausen, she went back to Amsterdam, where she reunited with her high school boyfriend Walter Kohner. He had managed to flee to the United States and came back to Europe as a US soldier. Hanna and Walter married, went to the United States, and in May 1953, they visit a recording of the popular TV show This Is Your Life.
This is Your Life, television's most talked about program. And now meet our host, Ralph Edwards. Hey, hello. How are you? Fine, thank you. Good to see you. How are you this evening? Hello, everyone. Thank you. Oh, thank you, too, for being with us again on This Is Your Life. Well, we're all set to go here. Let's have a look around and see whom we have here at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood. Lovely lady down here, too. Hello, how are you?
Fine.
Good. That's fine. May I have your name, please?
Hannah Kohner.
What is it?
Kohner. Hannah Kohner.
Hannah Kohner. Good. Oh, you're Mrs. Walter Kohner, the wife of the Hollywood
Yes.
talent agent. Yes. Is Walter with you?
Yes.
Where is he?
Well, he just went out. He'll be right back.
Oh, he will. Okay. I see you're in good hands, though. Ladies and gentlemen, the star of the soon-to-be-released 20th Century Fox picture, Sailor of the King, Jeffrey Hunter, right down here. Hello, Ralph. Hello, Jeffrey. My goodness. How you been, boy? Come on in here. Let's talk. Nice to have you with us, Jeff. And since you're here, how about having you help us find our principal subject, okay?
Well, I'll do anything I can.
All right. Would you just read for us what it says on the cover of this book, Jeff?
This is your life, Hannah Block-Koner.
Oh, no.
Yes? This is your life, Hannah Block-Koner. That is what it says.
My God.
This has been quite a switch. You thought it would be the life of your good friend Jeff Hunter here, didn't you? Yes, you thought it'd be the movie star Jeff Hunter. Is that right, Hannah? No, we'll have to do him sometime, but tonight it's you. Let's get her up, Jeff. Stand up with her. Thank you, Jeff Hunter, for helping us fool this lovely young lady. You betcha. We'll all be looking for you in Sailor of the King, Jeff.
Thank you, Ralph.
So, we'll say so long to Jeff Hunter and come on up with me to our Hazel Bishop stage, will you, Mrs. Koner? Come along here. And don't worry, we haven't kidnapped your husband at all. He'll appear, here we go, my dear, right in here. He'll appear at exactly the right moment. You see how that works out? Come on over here and take your place in our chair of honor, Hannah Block-Koner. You richly deserve this place. Come on over here by me. Lean on me for support if you need to.
You have a spare handkerchief.
Well, I have a spare handkerchief, and shall I give it to you now?
Oh, that's fine.
Well, as this is your life will prove, you richly deserve this. May I say, Mrs. Koner, that looking at you, it's hard to believe that during 7 short years of a still short life, you lived a lifetime of fear, terror, and tragedy. You look like a young American girl just out of college, not at all like a survivor of Hitler's cruel purge of German Jews. These, as well as happier events in your life, we will relive with you in just a moment.
This Is Your Life was a hit television show of the 1950s. It started as a radio program in 1948 and aired from 1952 to 1961 on NBC TV or national television. The concept of the show, as you have seen, was to surprise an uninformed guest from the audience with his or her own life history. In a half-hour program, the talk show host, Rolf Edwards, led through the entire life of the guest, which was set up beforehand and illustrated by photographs, music, and footage. Different television genres, from documentary and newsreel to melodrama and game show, were employed to present the lives of the guests as entertainingly as possible. Most of the time, the life stories of celebrities, actors, musicians, and athletes were presented. However, from time to time, normal people were chosen. They had in common that they had overcome great obstacles in their life. They included, for example, a woman who was born a slave, or a 100-year-old veteran of the Civil War, and a number of Holocaust survivors, out of whom Hannah Block-Koner was the first. After a few introductory words that outline the general narrative of the episode, the life history of Hannah Block-Koner is narrated chronologically. It begins with her happy childhood and youth in Teplitz-Schönau. A photograph of the picturesque old town is shown, and the host talks about the hot springs that already attracted the old Romans and later on Goethe, Beethoven, and Wagner. Suddenly, Hannah's old classmate Franzi Lieben appears on stage. It was one prominent feature of This Is Your Life to invite longtime friends to the show. Hannah and Franzi have not met for 15 years. Franzi Lieben was mainly invited to verify Hannah's happy childhood and youth. He submits to this quest and tells about their unburdened life in the spa town before the invasion and how Hannah met her future husband, Walter Koner, in spring 1934. A little later, the Horst Wessel song is played and footage of marching German soldiers is shown on screen. The narrative has now reached the wartime and the Holocaust. Another person steps on stage. It is Eva Herzberg, a friend of Hannah's who suffered with her through the Holocaust. Herzberg attempts in a somehow incomprehensible way to describe the conditions in Auschwitz. At this point, the host, Rolf Edwards, takes over. Voicefully, he adds a much more coherent and memorable description of Auschwitz. He says, "Well, you were sent to the so-called showers, and even this was a doubtful procedure, because some showers had regular water, others had liquid gas, and you never knew which one you were being sent to. You and Eva were fortunate, others were not so fortunate, including your father and mother. They all lost their lives at Auschwitz." After Auschwitz, the dark peak of the show, Edwards jumps to Hannah's liberation by General Patton's Great Army and to the moment she met Walter Kona again. Her emigration to the United States constitutes the great finale. "Your dreams come true at last," declaims Edwards. "You sailed to America in July of 1946. Well, Hannah Bloch Kona, this is your life, safe and happy in the country of your adoption." From a present-day perspective, This Is Your Life, Hannah Bloch Kona, is a grotesque and melodramatic presentation of a Holocaust survivor. You get the overall impression that Hannah gained more by the Holocaust than she lost. She gained a new life in the United States. The price she had to pay was the loss of almost her entire family. Put into its historical context, the objective of the show obviously was to prove that a victim of extreme mass violence was able to turn into a decent and functioning American. A victim of Hitler has become the epitome of an American girl just out of college. It shows how this great country offers redemption in exile and deliverance from suffering. The melodramatic account follows the basic laws of entertainment, which is probably not that surprising to find on television, especially on early American television. However, and now I come to the second part of my paper, if you look closely, you find out that the presentation of the life history of a Holocaust survivor in This Is Your Life has in a certain way prevailed from the 1950s to today. In fact, it mirrors several facets of videotaped interviews with survivors. By now, these interviews are well known to everyone. I just want to give you a very brief overview about these testimonies. In 1979, the Holocaust Survivors Film Project in New Haven, the later Fortune Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale, began to videotape interviews with survivors. This project was style-forming for interviews with survivors of the Holocaust around the world. As a side note, these interviews were created to counter the seminal miniseries Holocaust, which was perceived as being falsifying and trivializing the past, but this is a different story. In the 1980s and early 1990s, dozens of other organizations began to interview survivors, and in 1994, Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation was founded. Today, there are, according to my calculations, over 80,000 interviews with survivors and other witnesses of the Holocaust that have emerged on the initiative of American organizations. These interviews send a powerful call for more tolerance. They serve as a warning to prevent further genocides and to educate future generations. They were conducted to defy Holocaust deniers, to honor the murdered victims, and to help survivors to deal with their traumatic experiences. The eyewitness interviews shaped the memory of the Holocaust, changed permanently the scientific method oral history, and are today an influential part of the digital humanities. Finally, these testimonies granted survivors the greatest authority and authenticity about the past. Without question, these testimonies have a very different objective than the TV show This Is Your Life from the 1950s. However, these two different cultural products reveal some striking visual as well as narrative similarities. The visual similarities, for example, concern the scenery, as you can see in the two stills from This Is Your Life, and an interview of the Shoah Foundation that was conducted with Leslie Eichner on March 12, 1995. The scenery of This Is Your Life is a living room. In almost every detail, it is reminiscent of video interviews of the Shoah Foundation that were conducted in the living rooms of Holocaust survivors. The furniture, the curtains, and even the flower arrangement and fore and background resemble each other. This scenery embodies the home of the ideal American upper middle class. The survivors in this setting appear healthy and well off, and their outwardly appearance gives no clue to their dramatic past. Their depiction establishes the image of survivors as courageous persons and returns a fraction of the dignity and humanity the Nazis attempted to destroy, as James Young argued. At the end of This Is Your Life, Hannah is reunited with her family and her friends. The group picture at the end reveals another striking similarity to interviews of the Shoah Foundation. It was Spielberg's only demand that the survivor must have been shown within his or her family circle at one point of the interview. This group picture provides survival with a meaning that exceeds testifying for the dead and murdered. By including children and grandchildren of the survivor, the triumph of survival is symbolized, and the victim's story of persecution and violence is provided with a reconciling end. The group picture became a signature feature of the Shoah Foundation and can be found in almost half of all its 52,000 interviews. By the way, the efficacious visualization of survival is already used at the end of Schindler's List, where survivors and their descendants pilgrimage to Schindler's gravesite. But now, as the final part of my presentation, I come to the most important mutual feature. The TV show and most video testimonies share a common emplotment. The following analysis is based on Hayden White, the great theorist of historiography, who offered a promising tool to explain the emplotment of historical narratives. He employed discourse analysis as an analysis of the discourses of historians. Stories told about the past are described as linguistic artifacts and treated similar to the rhetoric of fictional texts. White described how first events are organized in the form of a chronicle by putting them in the temporal order of their occurrence. The chronicle is then turned into a story by arranging the events into a hierarchy of significance. Events are assigned with different functions, and hence a discernible and comprehensive story with a beginning, middle, and end is invented. Basically, White identified 4 different archetypal modes of emplotment: romance, tragedy, comedy, and satire. According to White, every history, even the most synchronic or structural history, is in some way provided with a plot, because it serves an important purpose. By choosing a mode of emplotment, the historian identifies the kind of story and provides it with meaning. Meaning and coherence is created because the basic and archetypal plots are known by the historians as well as by the audience. Although Hayden White focuses mainly on the work of historians, there are good reasons that justify the adoption of his ideas to cinematic representations of the past and visual history interviews. Both do organize events into discernible and comprehensive stories, and both do claim to deliver narratives that really happened in a historically accurate way. Therefore, White's theory can be employed to analyze survivors' testimonies as well as the TV series This Is Your Life. Following Hayden White, the TV show and the testimonies have given the Holocaust a coherent and effective narrative with an archetypal plot. The introduction of both products is concerned with the immediate happy pre-war period. The middle part is occupied with the devastating wartime. They end with the liberation and usually with a short description of the emigration to Israel, the United States, or elsewhere. American organizations like the Fortune Video Archive or the Shoah Foundation persistently perpetuated and formalized this emplotment. Partly this was done by the performative practice of interviewing, but also through extensive pre-interview questionnaires, that means questionnaires which are presented to the interviewees a couple of days before the interview. These questionnaires determine the subsequent narrative before the actual interviews takes place. The ideal interview is structured as follows: 15 to 20% of the interviews on the pre-war experiences of the survivors, 60 to 70% on the wartime, and 15 to 20% on the post-war period. This is an ideal division which most interviews aim at, but which is only achieved by very few interviews exactly. This Is Your Life, which is, with its stronger focus on the post-war time, slightly differs from the guidelines of the video projects. However, it is within the scope of many actual video testimonies. To be precise, 20% of the TV show is on the happy pre-war time of Hannah in Taubitz. 40% is on the wartime, the peak of the story, and another 40% is on the post-war period, including the liberation by American troops and the emigration to the United States. This plot has prevailed. It was to some extent more successful than other competing plots. Today, this narrative structure of survivors' life history seems obvious, and any deviation from it is noticeable. Employing Hayden White's analysis of historical narratives, it becomes clear that the form they chose is not, as it is often colloquially accepted, the tragedy, but the comedy. And to be clear, I'm not referring to the humorous or ironic elements of a comedy, but to its structural or narrative form. The threefold division of the comedy leads from the state of external peace to the unveiling of the conflict, and from there to its resolution with the establishment of a truly peaceful society. The outer peace as a starting point is, as already stated, an integral part of This Is Your Life, as well as of almost all oral history interviews that were conducted since 1979. This world is thrown into chaos out of which arises a peaceful social order. And this is the melodramatic trick of the TV show, and in a sense, the genuine element of an oral history interviews, which reflects the past from the safe hindsight. I quote Hayden White, "The reconciliations which occur at the end of a comedy are reconciliations of man with their world and their society. The condition of society is represented as being purer, saner, and healthier. The triad of a happy pre-war period as the introduction, a devastating war period as the central part, and a conciliatory post-war period as the final part, therefore corresponds with the structure of a comedy which is concise, effective, and coherent. This narrative has indeed proved so effective that it is still today reproduced in very similar ways, not only in video testimonies, but also in other representations of the Holocaust, such as feature films, miniseries, museum exhibitions, memoirs, and so on. Although there are important differences between survivors' testimonies and This Is Your Life, the overarching narrative mirrors each other. The plot of a comedy constructs the Holocaust story in terms of heroic dignity, moral courage, and the triumph of the human spirit in adversity. Already 30 years ago, this was criticized by Lawrence Langer as the American vision of the Holocaust. In my understanding, it is characteristically that this vision constantly is perpetuated by American survivors' testimonies as well as television. Popular TV programs, such as This Is Your Life, therefore, are not the antithesis of life history, as Jeffrey Chandler has indicated. On the contrary, television was quite early able to establish the visual and narrative paradigms by which the life stories of Holocaust survivors were presented decades later. Thank you.
Dear Mr. Taubitz, I thank you very much that you have also taken in account the 20 minutes you had to your disposal. And we'll continue now with our dear colleagues from Belgrade. Professor Daković and Professor Milovanović will now, pardon? You were before. Okay, sorry. Sorry, I still have to wake up, I'm sorry. So I apologize. So Mrs. Yael Munk from the Open University of Israel in Tel Aviv will speak now to the role of Israeli television in the enlarging of the boundaries of the Holocaust, a documentary discourse. Mrs. Munk, may I ask you?
Okay, so I will speak about Israeli television, and I should mention here that as opposed to many of the participants here, I'm a film scholar and less an historian, but still film and history has a lot in common, as you know, so we'll be dealing with this issue as well. Almost 70 years ago, after the end of World War II, Holocaust memories have become increasingly blurred. Many efforts have been devoted to writing and even recording memories. The entire world has joined to present and represent possible images of the unimaginable. In doing so, they had given birth to post-memory, a concept that has been developed by Marianne Hirsch. Post-memory, and it's a bit long quotation, post-memory, she writes, describes the relationship that the generation after those who witnessed cultural and collective trauma bears to experiences of those who came before, experiences they remember only by means of stories, images, and behavior among which they grew up. But these experiences, I continue, it's still the quote, but these experiences were transmitted to them so deeply and effectively as to seem to constitute memories in their own. Post-memory's connection to the past is thus not actually mediated by recall, but imaginative investment, projection, and creation. to grow up, that's the end of the quotation, to grow up with such overwhelming inherited memories, to be dominated by narratives that precedes one's birth or one's consciousness, is to risk having one's own stories and experience displaced, even evacuated, by those of a previous generation, end of quote. This lecture engages with Israeli television's contribution to the post-memory discourse of the Holocaust through the bias of a new kind of documentary filmmaking, the archive-motivated documentary. Since the beginning of the new millennium, as Holocaust survivors have become increasingly rare, the Holocaust cinematic discourse has tended to abandon the investigation or reconstruction of the past per se, and instead it addresses its various forms of representation, which seems to have changed considerably following the series of geotechnological developments. I refer here both to the fall of the Berlin Wall on the one hand and the opening of the East Berlin archives, and at the same time at the technologies that it relates to the lecture we heard, the first lecture, the opening lecture we had, the technologies that has developed new ways to look at the past. These technopolitical innovations have influenced individual subjectivity. These two tendencies would seem to have converged, enabling larger populations, and not necessarily the second or third generation to the Holocaust, to expand and investigate the deeper stratum that constitutes this historical traumatic event or its visual depiction. This shift in focus has many implications for the nature of the cinematic Holocaust narrative, one of the most important of which is that it leaves aside most forms of sentimentality. And this is an important point that I will try to demonstrate later on. Nowadays, it seems that television has, in general, and Israeli television in particular, have gradually moved away from the moving, authentic testimonies of survivors in order to make room for no less important issues, the construction of memory, and more particularly the construction and preservation of the Holocaust memory. This latter issue, as this talk will seek to demonstrate, seems to be crucial for the state of Israel. Consequently, the nature of the change in the documentary scripts evolves, and the cinematic intertext, that is, the hidden text that carries all the various contentions, has become more dominant. In other words, we're no longer dealing with an effort to convey a terrible human tragedy that happened in real life, but rather by the ways to convey by which to convey its preservation in cinematic terms. This is, of course, a result of the endless images that in the last decade have enabled the issue to re-emerge in documentaries as well as in fiction films and television series. During the recent years, after long internal negotiation regarding the implication of integrating the Holocaust memory into national one, the State of Israel has chosen to present the Holocaust as an integral part of memory and to adopt both victims and survivors as national heroes. This explained the specific name of the day chosen to commemorate the Holocaust victims, the Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day, Yom HaShoah VaGvura, which is held on the 27th of Nisan, Hebrew month of Nisan. It's April-May, according to the Jewish calendar, and its juxtaposition to the Remembrance Day to the fallen soldiers, which is just 1 week after, and their juxtaposition to the Independence Day, which is altogether, it happened that within 8 weeks, less than 2 weeks, 8 days. Within 8 days, you have all these commemorations together. Independence Day is not commemoration, but whatever. All these events come one after the other. These rhetorical infrastructures that arrived rather late in Israeli culture in the 60s reveals the state's effort to acknowledge the Holocaust victims. Later still, in 1980, the Ministry of Education enacted a new law according to which high school students are supposed to make a compulsory visit to the Nazi concentration camps. A position which has been highly criticized by Israeli intellectuals, and I'm not going to get into it, but into discussion maybe later. From a historical point of view, one may say that the decision to commemorate such a date was not an easy one, in that it reminded the new Jew in Zion of these weaker and persecuted ancestors in diaspora. The State of Israel, therefore, mostly emphasized the dimension of heroical resistance and not the suffering of the victims. It did so through education programs and also through the television that for a long time there was only one channel, for a long time was the official representation of the government's voice. Thus, whereas the international Holocaust visual discourse represented the horror perpetrated by the Nazis by using close-up shots of individuals, apparently, it's a quote, apparently stripped of everything of the Western imagination associated with meaningful existence, Israel and its official television avoided painful images while forbidding shots of the naked, dehumanized Jewish bodies in the concentration camps or of the mass graves. But times have changed and Israel is no longer isolated from the world. Images that would have been once censored are now broadcast, and the Israeli population, especially those defined as the third generation, learned about this various point of view of the Holocaust and various ways by which to narrate this terrible chapter of history. In other words, the visualization of this specific historical chapter is now fed by two dimensions, the historical and the visual, which are, of course, not the same. And so, just as we can learn from the cinematic research of history by Rosenstone, for instance, visuals can often alter our historical vision of the world. Finally, a last dimension should be added to this argument, and that is the privatization of Israeli television that began early in the beginning of the 1990s and still continues to grow. One of the consequences of this privatization is a search for additional funds for documentary filmmaking, besides those offered by the state and its film foundations, in order to increase the local productions and their production value. These additional funds come from various European sources that plan to broadcast these documentaries in their own countries, retaining the right to introduce changes, tiny changes, I should say, changes in the initial script up to a certain point. These changes are intended to meet their target audience mentality and vision of history. As a result of these broadcasting changes on Israeli television, we are now witness to a new interesting phenomenon, and one that no one had foreseen. Holocaust narrative has become less historical and its human dimension more blurred for the sake of cinematic originality. Indeed, it is often presented as a sort of thriller in which the crime has been shown at the exhibition, or it's known from the exhibition. So now the viewers concentrate on the discovery dimension, looking attentively for each and every detail on screen in order to learn about how the filmmaker's discovery has been achieved. This démarche, which is arguable, I agree, bears two dimensions that I shall try to demonstrate through two important Israeli television documentaries, maybe the most important of the last years. Arnon Goldfinger's The Flat from 2011, and Yael Cholsonsky, A Filmed and Finished, 2012, both produced in collaboration between Israeli television and two German television channels, Arte and ZDF. Arnon Goldfinger's The Flat from 2011 is about the filmmaker's accidental uncovering of an unknown chapter in his family history. Upon the death of his grandmother, while he is cleaning out her apartment, he finds an exchange of letters between his grandparents and the German couple before, during, and after the war. I should say that Goldfinger is a German origin, as you can understand from his name. It's not a coincidence that his grandparents corresponded with Germans. A short investigation revealed that this Nazi friend was no other than Eichmann's commander, Leopold von Mildenstein. Shocked by the revelation, Goldfinger decides to travel to Germany and meet with the Nazi's daughter, who lives in Wuppertal with her family, and there he learns about an entire dimension of his past that he has ignored. He confronts his mother with the findings and they decided to return to her with her to visit the Nazi daughter. There, it's a very short summary of what the film is about. It's a fascinating film that you should see. There, under his mother's eyes, he reveals and proves to the daughter her father's Nazi past, leaving her devastated. But similarly, a mother undergoes a painful experience as she learns that her grandmother, who had remained in Germany after the family left in the 1930s, has been sent to a concentration camp. There she had perished. No one remains unmarked, clean from this film noir-like investigation, except for the grandson, the Israeli filmmaker who had no clue about his German family connection to the Holocaust. And by the way, I should say that is only one example of many other Israelis who don't know anything about their past, Jewish past. And just like in the film noir, the film ends by pointing at the filmmakers as emerging from a void, the void of the state, the void the state has constructed in its attempt to control and decide what should be the hegemonic memory. It is for these reasons that the flat cannot be regarded as part of the third generation filmmaking. Director Goldfinger had no intention of making a film about the third generation to the Holocaust. He didn't know he was part of it. But during his journey, he undergoes through, the journeys he undergoes through in his investigation has led him to the recognition that he is one. This acknowledgement of the moral failure, his moral failure as an Israeli, finally makes him more human and more compassionate, and the viewer comes to feel empathy for him. But this is not the case with Yael Chalsonsky, who takes us with no previous warning to the East Berlin bunkers, where some of the Nazi-produced films have been stored unrevealed until today. A film unfinished with Hebrew name, The Silence of the Archives, may be much more insightful, is indeed an unfinished propaganda film shot by the Nazi regime inside the Warsaw Ghetto. Its original footage reveals its intentions to show that the Jews led a completely normal life in spite of the restricted dimensions of the ghetto, and that violence against the Jews was rare and exceptional. But the filmmaker, Chalsonsky, juxtaposes the shooting of the film, the footage she fought, together with the footage of the documenting of the film. We have two films edited together, which was shot at the same time and shows those poor and starving Jews who were not selected to play in the film that was supposed to show the good life of the Jews. Now, if I have time, I would like to show a clip of the film. I'm not sure I have time. I have time? Okay. 6 minutes? If we have a problem, I don't mind going on, and if you find a clip, we'll show it.
Okay, just
okay.
on that.
You have it? Okay. Compromise. I'll continue with my lecture, and remember what I said. I'll show you a clip from Yael Chalsonsky's film. Hopefully we'll find it, and the machine will work. This non-official documentation gives the viewer an authentic picture of the ghetto with beggar and sick people dying in the middle of the street. Since the hunger, this is a chapter. Yeah? What? Okay?
Yeah, just need to.
Let's go. 5.
This is what we need. What's 15?
6 minutes, you said?
Okay, it's on.
It's on? Okay.
אתם רואים את האשפה? ככה היו זורקים אשפה מחלונות, כי אנשים לא היה להם כוח כבר לרדת. בן אדם שהוא רעב מגיע לאפתיה לגמרי, לא אכפת לו כלום.
זה אמיתי, הרימות הזבל. אני ילדה בת 10. הייתי בעצם הדמות הדומיננטית במשפחה. אמא הייתה שולחת אותי למזבלה העירונית של ורשה. כשהייתי חוזרת, ראיתי איך שאוכלים את מה שאני מביאה.
Piętnasty maja 1942 roku. Po obiedzie filmowcy zrobili zdjęcia w sypialni u sąsiadów zabłudowskich. Sprowadzono jakąś kobietę, która się szminkowała przed lustrem. Poza tym na mieście dalej pogłoski o wysiedleniu. Zdaje się, że pogłoski mają pewną podstawę. Komisarz zarządził dostawę 900 ludzi do nieznanego obozu na jutro rano. Odbyła się łapanka na ulicy.
Haben Sie den Kommissar für den jüdischen Wohnbezirk im Warschauer Ghetto, Dr. Heinz Auerswald, getroffen?
Der Name ist mir nicht bekannt. Ich habe mit seiner Dienststelle nichts zu tun gehabt.
Herr Wist, können Sie uns nach Ihrem besten Wissen sagen, ob bei der Erteilung des Filmauftrages zur Sprache kam, welchen Zwecken die Aufnahmen dienen?
Thank you very much. So you see this rare authentic footage, the documentation of the ghetto in Warsaw, which is quite special and quite, it's very rare actually. And you see how the Germans tried to stage an alternative reality according to which rich women were standing in front of the mirror and putting lipstick as if nothing was happening. Now, as I said, this non-official documentation gives the viewer an authentic picture of the ghetto with beggars and sick people dying in the middle of the street. But since the film was found with no sound, the filmmaker decided to interpret these images of the ghetto through a voiceover. And this is important because the voiceover, now it's a cinematic knowledge, not Shoah knowledge, so the voiceover can change the meaning of a picture, as you all know. The film presents 3 different soundtracks, which are certainly edited over the visual. The first one belongs to the diary of the Nazi commander of the ghetto, the second to the head of the Judenrat, and the third to the Nazi filmmaker whose hand you just saw now, who was sent to document the ghetto, but had no idea what was the purpose of his mission. He was told to document the ghetto, and so he did. Chersonsky adds to these soundtracks readings from the letters and personal diaries of the Jewish inhabitants of the ghetto. I don't know about the permissions, if she had permissions or not, if there was someone to ask for permission. Anyway, it's an ambiguous situation, reading personal letters and personal diaries. Finally, she shoots the screening of these multi-layered film sequences to Holocaust survivors who had once lived in the Warsaw ghetto. You just saw them now. There's like five of them. The suffering of the latter when confronted with their repressed past, the repressed part of their life, is clear. But the viewer is no less shocked when they realize that these brave people who have accepted to be re-exposed to the source of their trauma are being victimized once again when the filmmaker decides to show them devoid of any caption, as if anonymous once more, just as they were during the filming of the ghetto. This documentary, A Film Unfinished, indeed provides an excellent illustration of this new tendency in Israeli Holocaust documentary. The Holocaust is represented as another planet, according to the Holocaust survivor Katzetnik definition, and as such, it represents an endless source of narrative and visual materials. Accordingly, in A Film Unfinished, the human dimension vanishes in order to make room for the bizarre and incredible tales of this other planet. This seems to match Al Forster's contention about the postmodern use of the archive, a use that seems to have emerged, and I quote, out of a sense of failure in cultural memory. As far as we know, this approach, according to which the Holocaust is a compilation of incredible tales from another time or another planet, has not been approved by the Israeli television decision makers. But if we are to judge them, however, by the funding of the Israeli Holocaust documentaries, and more particularly by the German co-founders, the German television channels of ZDF and Arte, for example, which is only two of them, it seemed that this tragic chapter of Jewish history has been transformed and relocated into a distant, uncanny, and suspenseful tales, in which the identity of the murderer is already revealed in the film's very beginning. And all that the viewer follows is a smart and unexpected maneuver of the detective, the filmmaker, to reveal the crime. In conclusion, one may contend that Israeli television new Holocaust documentary have found ways to distance themselves from concrete pain. With the Holocaust having become an international issue that concerns many more people than a specific ethnicity, Jewish or similar, Israeli television has decided to turn its back on first-hand documentation, i.e. testimony, and look for more subtle intellectual ways to reflect on this modern crime. In doing so, Israeli television joins the world standpoint that refuse to be directly implicated, even partially, in past crimes, and rejects the effects of the post-memory. Instead, it delves into the universal archives of an extreme evil in order to reflect intellectually on modernity's most terrible crime. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Munk, and I apologize. Sorry. But now it's the right time to announce the lecture of our two colleagues from Belgrade, Professor Daković and Professor Milovanović. Both are teaching and searching at the Department of Theory and History at the University of Arts in Belgrade. And today they will speak about Holocaust, war and memories, patterns of reception in former Yugoslavia. Please, may I ask?
Thank you, and first, thank you all for accepting the paper and for giving us a chance to participate in such exciting and interesting conference, and of course for allowing us to become intruders and to parachute into the unscheduled, so to say, session. And I'm very happy because I think that our paper would fit quite well what Jan already said about the conversion of the narrative and of the genre of the narrative of the survivors. So, the aim of this paper is to map out the patterns of reception of the famous American mega saga or mega series Winds of War and War and Remembrance, respectively broadcasted on Yugoslav television in 1986, 1990, and then again in 2005, 2006 on Serbian television. The paper seeks to compare the models of reception from three discernible periods, 86, 90, and 2005 and 6, as explored and reconstructed through the analysis of TV critiques, polemics, and debates in the press for the former, and more but less in scope through websites, blogs, and other digital texts for the latter case. The differences in the patterns of the reception testify about the changing paradigm of the memory narratives of the Holocaust in Serbia, as well as about their place in the collective memory and visual culture. Specifically, the paper would like to connect every period with a certain dominant social effects or the change of narrative model it caused. The miniseries Holocaust from 1978 was never officially shown on TV in former Yugoslavia or present-day Serbia. It was shown only in 2009 on federal TV in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1979, however, in Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, timidly appeared the article about the reactions that Holocaust series provoked in Germany. Under the bombastic title TV Under Police Protection, it was saturated with the rhetoric usual for the socialist countries that came to terms with the Holocaust in Europe and as Nazis' guilt and responsibility with the guilt of the others quite early, but not with the Holocaust on their own territory organized by local Quisling or Quisling states. The reasons for the symptomatic absence are diverse, ranging from the lack of interest of the responsible for the import of the TV program, overwhelming local and other American productions, but also overall incompatibility of the Holocaust memory and media politics. Beside a number of films from 1960, among which the most important are Ninth Circle, also directed by our nominee for Oscar a couple of years ago, and Himmelkommando, which is a very specific because of its narrative agency that is in fact a perfect witness of the Holocaust, the one dead, muted, unable to speak, but yet being witness capable to become homodiegetic narrator. The only TV series really about Holocaust was produced only in 1977, with the accent more on gender perspective than anything else. The title of the series is Maria, directed by Stipe Delic, very famous for being also director of Sutjeska, one of the mega partisan epics or spectacles. The history of Yugoslav Jewry and Holocaust was almost invisible outside local close circles or immersed into the global World War II martyr liberation revolution here within the bracket story. On macro-state level, Holocaust remembrance was small but ever-present constituent of the narratives about World War II, seen primarily as anti-fascist war and socialist revolution. The figures of Jewish intellectuals, such as mentioned Moshe Piada yesterday, party members, but less of persecuted ordinary members of the Jewish community appear regularly, but noticeable only for the highly sensitized audience. Delicate issues of local concentration camps, such as Jasenovac, were kept low profile, its ambivalence pushed under the carpet, or revived only in the third millennium with the big research projects, such as already mentioned Judenlager Zemlin. So, the first pattern of reception from 1986. The real wave of TV Holocaust came only with the winds of war, bit paradoxically more with the first than with the second part. I say paradoxically because the second part, War and Remembrance, is exclusively about Holocaust, while in the first part it features, but not so promptly. Winds of War were aired on Friday nights on the first channel of state TV in prime time slot. The accompanying articles in the specialized magazines about TV program, TV Novosti, TV Revi, and Studio, were of 4 different formats. First, basically comments and recaps what we are to see in the next episode, inserted as antefile in the TV program scheme. B. Numerous articles about production and stars. The series was announced, generally through reprints from the foreign press or press material forwarded with it, as one of the most ambitious and most expensive series about World War II of all times. The bond was strengthened by the fact that it was partially shot in Zagreb, as one of the biggest co-productions of Jadran film. The titles were mainly like Zagreb playing Warsaw, or were concerned with the star cast headed by Robert Mitchum and Ally McGraw. Their careers were retold in a hall with habitual mentioning of their previous roles, like film noir Farewell My Beauty, Out of the Past for Mitchum, and of course Love Story for Ally McGraw. C. The most curious case that directly connected Winds of War with Holocaust was Phaeton entitled Last Jew in Berlin, narrating the fates of the Jewish population in Germany from early 1930s to Kristallnacht to the end of the war. Unusually serious topics stood apart from the habitual light tone of TV Novosti, providing welcome balance or counterbalance, as well as a popular way of raising awareness about and raising visibility of the Holocaust in general. D. Eventually, a bridge and simplified 2-page phaeton was published simultaneously with the series, but carefully not to reveal the content of the next episode. In the meantime, between Winds of War and War in Remembrance, both Herman Wouk's books were published in Serbo-Croatian, and the cover page were in fact scenes from the TV series, and thus the audience was able to see what would happen with their favorite characters. Nevertheless, Holocaust was seen in a disguise of a love and war romance as individualized topic more than it would be, contrary to the expected, in the War and Remembrance. Resumes made after TV episodes revealed the Holocaust to younger generations as important part of world history, however not stirring the local community or the local narratives. The overall effects of the first part of the saga are focused on the introduction of the Holocaust as a pop cultural topic and enhancement of its visibility. The immediate effects on the local memory politics or media productions were not present. although being pervasively trivializing representation, as Chandler puts it, widely and easily disdained as a trivializing or corrupting force, it is seen as a vehicle that cannot help but produce unsatisfactory representations of the Holocaust. But nevertheless, these unsatisfactory representations of the Holocaust universalized Holocaust to audience, making horror and the inconceivable accessible. Now, only 4 years later, we have the second pattern of reception. In the 4 years interlude between Winds of War and War and Remembrance, local context had dramatically changed. The state TV stations had become more divergent, and a number of local pirate-like TV stations began to flourish uncontrollably. So there was no big story dedicated to the series, although being recognized as the mega success and officially bought by state TV, not pirately shown, in the country on the brink of disaster, Weimar-like hyperinflation, and the political tensions unmistakably mounting to the war that would sweep over former Yugoslavia. The reprise of the Winds of War as intro to the premiere of the War and Remembrance was given decent slot of the weekend night program, but was often running very late as the TV news were getting longer and longer. We were hearing about atrocities, demonstrations, protests, and so on. There were no accompanying feuilletons. However, it is worth noticing that TV Novosti ran the feuilleton about the events of the eve of the breakup of former Yugoslavia. The war tensions on and off the screen became inextricably linked together, as you can see after the titles. Yugoslavia is deconstructed or brought down since 1939. Can I have the next slide, I believe? No, and you have also the armaments, the spy affairs, and so on and so on. So, when War and Remembrance finals began, the series was recognized as Americanized history of World War II and successful and much acclaimed blending of facts, fiction, and history into long and detailed docudrama. For younger and the older generation, it featured as the compendium of official history or a loose refreshment of memory and history. However, it was not seen as a Jewish American history in which the persecution of Jews is a dominant theme. Such option of recognizing that as a Jewish version of the world history was overruled by the interpretation of interethnic and civil wars that would soon break out in former Yugoslavia. In fact, Marko Živković, an anthropologist from Canada, brilliantly analyzed the wish to be a Jew in a recent Yugoslav conflict as the wish to be automatically identified as a helpless victim devoid of any responsibility. And here, yesterday, there was a question whether the Central European culture of memory influenced the remembrance of the Holocaust in former Yugoslavia. I would quite agree with Hans Jürgen that definitely the answer is no. The local context, constellation of different events, in fact, stirred the remembrance of the Holocaust as politically manipulated for the daily political aims and options. In his article, The Wish to be a Jew, or the Power of the Jewish Trope in the Yugoslav conflict, he in fact says that, that everyone wanted to be labeled as a Jew in the recent Yugoslav conflicts. At one moment, on the rally in Cankarjev Dan in Ljubljana, both Slovenian and Serbian intellectuals claimed their respective nations to have the role of the Jews, and the other one to be automatically labeled as Nazis. It's a first moment of sort of birth of the multidirectional memory as defined by Michael Rothberg. The second moment of the birth of the multidirectional memory would happen in 2010, when in power in Serbia was Boris Tadić, a member of the Democratic Party. He was at the same time president of the Jewish-Serbian Alliance, and he was very prone to Israel as in state politics. In that moment, they opened the whole project of the Judenlager Zemlin, and they opened it on the anniversary, I would say, on the day of the commemoration of the beginning of the NATO bombardment of Serbia. So, in fact, you have layers of different historical events placed above each other and based as referring to the position of Serbs as equal to the position of the Jews in a global timeline, historical timeline, and succession of events. Also, there was another obvious analogy. Milosevic, until late 1990s, labeled as the American man in the Balkans and Serbia as the key factor of stability in the Balkans, gave foundations for the Serbian appropriation of American superior role in the local wars. Tudjman and Izetbegović, of course, were right behind Milosevic's heels, as every country in the local war wanted to be as American in the World War II. The major paradox on the level of the series is that the first part is almost exclusively associated with the Holocaust, while the second part, directly dealing with the Holocaust, is seen as the story about the world at war, or as put in the international publicity, tales of America's direct involvement in the war. Eventually, the war and remembrance provoked together less interest or attention. The articles in TV Novosti, TV Revi, and Studio, except the announcement that the series would be shown and a few reviews, failed the chance to mention Jewish aspect and perspective. In the international press were comments like, much of War and Remembrance is told through Aaron Jastrow's diaries, which recount his journeys from fascist Italy through Vichy France, occupied France, Terezin, and ultimately Auschwitz. Aaron goes from being a somewhat arch and cynical scholar to rediscovering his Jewish heritage and coming to terms with God, all while the noose of Nazism is being lowered around his neck. In Yugoslavia, national identities overwhelmed the Jewish one. It's supported by a controversy, in fact, that Jews were perfectly assimilated and wholeheartedly welcomed in Serbia and Bosnia. They're almost blended with the local population. But on the other hand, Serbia, Belgrade was the first Judified city in the occupied Europe, and Serbia was, after Estonia, second Judified country in the occupied Europe. Similarly, although many of the Yugoslavs were in Auschwitz, where there is a still Yugoslav pavilion, and there is a huge debate how the dismembered Yugoslavia would handle the exhibition in that Yugoslav pavilion, right above Austrian one, I believe. Our history there is accordingly recognized as Yugoslav and only in the second place as the Yugoslav Jewish history. No one mentioned the fact that the series was the first film production granted permission to film inside Auschwitz concentration camp. No one even mentioned Topol, already known for his role in The Fiddler on the Roof that was shot in former Yugoslavia as one of the co-productions of Avala and Jadran film. One of the producers of the series was Branko Lustig from Croatia, who moved to LA and after he got Oscar for Schindler's List and Gladiator, but that was kept a very low profile. The theory of the presentation of Holocaust, ethic debates, and so on were barely audible or present in Yugoslavia. And even today, when we come across the famous example of the breach of the ethic of the presentation, such as in a Himmler's tour of Auschwitz, there is a gas chamber, full frontal scene with the death and so on, we have to go back to search for that in the series. We can't remember that all of a sudden. So the debates about ethics of representation were not transferred to Yugoslav case and into the Yugoslavia occupied with the problems of its own. And finally, then we had years of hyperinflation, then we had the breakup of former country, then we had NATO bombing in Belgrade and so on, and finally we come to the year 2005. It should be mentioned that the years from 2000 to today are marked by the constant reprise and rerun of all available programs, regardless of their popularity, quality, or topic. Beside that, the reception is reshaped by the new context and circumstances, such as the life story and career of Branko Lustig, or even more, by the disintegration of former Yugoslavia. Lustig became well known in the meantime, and his role in the production of the Holocaust series and films was emphasized on every occasion. Republic of Hrvatska, meaning New Republic of Hrvatska, gave him honorary degrees, medals of the highest order, etc. The esteem and respect shown to Lustig were the discreet but paramount arguments that Croatia, New Croatia, is modern, cosmopolitan state, ready to apologize for its anti-Semitism and Holocaust, as well as for the legacy of Ustasha and independent state of Croatia that hung over new state. Rerun of Winter War and War in Remembrance was on TVB 92. At the moment, that was a very prominent independent radio and television station with an aura of being anti-Milosevic and pro-democracy, both TV station and NGO. And it overlapped with their production of Independent for Truth that made Serbia face the truth about its recent past, a sine qua non for reconciliation, truth, way to democracy and the EU. Documentary film one from the series, The Past Lasts Forever, shown at the same time as the series, has researched German decades-long coming to terms with World War II crimes as process or dilemmas similar to those Serbs were facing at the moment. Project was looking for the answers about the burden of responsibility, second or third generation, or the fact about collective guilt and responsibility. However, for new generations, the series came almost without any previous knowledge, as visible in the blogs. Comment on the blog in Belgrade, serial program Shame of B92. There is no targeted audience for the series Winds of War. To have the targeted audience, you have to have the idea and vision of the program. And that is not the case with B92. I suppose they got the series gratis, together with all these stale and forgotten films they announced for the season 2005-2006. Or one from the Croatia. I think that would be great to buy this series. Cast of exceptional quality, fiction, but also semi-documentary series. Partially it was shot in Croatia and of all places in Osijek. Obviously he doesn't know that Osijek was a huge ghetto. Đakovo concentration camp was near Osijek, and plus Osijek is birthplace of Branko Lustig, but he obviously doesn't know all that. Comment of someone with better memory, who puts War and Remembrance on the list of series to be seen again, together with a light-toned series like Bangkok Hilton, Town Like Alice, Master of the Game, or I'll Take Manhattan. Adding the note about Robert Mitchum. From the last comment, it is obvious that the heart-rendering love story of Mitchum and Victoria Tennant takes the primacy in the plot, and that the night program of TV Belgrade and other TV centers in the 80s is seen as a paradigm of great series. Jan already mentioned that conversion, or taking the primacy of romance over tragedy. I wouldn't say comedy, I would vote for romance over tragedy. And I distinctly remember that the generation of my parents, they were commenting from the whole War and Remembrance, they were just remembering the scene where Mitchum and Victoria Tennant are in the mission on the Russian front, and it's a freezing outside, they're all drinking vodka, they're singing, and Victoria Tennant at one moment she begins to dance, and Robert Mitchum is looking at her in a way from his film noir style, because I'm looking at you, kid, and at that moment the romance, open romance, breaks between the two. So, the third model of reception is a turning point where the history and trauma become commoditized and for mass entertainment. The visual economy of the Holocaust industry, as Finkelstein says, creates a form of inescapability where repetition entraps memory into a bind, where the repetition of visuals can lead to an anesthetization of trauma. Although on general level, 2000s are marked by the shift in the politics of the remembrance of the Holocaust, its serious rediscovery, research, raising visibility of the Jewish community and heritage in general, the art and media texts are shaped almost exclusively after the Hollywood models. They are transforming an ontological event into a soap opera, as after Wiesel's famous statement. Representation of the Holocaust simplified the event as a trope of good versus evil, making it adaptable to the grand plot of cinematic devices of Hollywood. It could be seen as initiation of the bit-delayed wave of Holocaust films in all former Yugoslav republics. The authors of When Day Breaks, Third Half, and Lea and Daria changed Holocaust into something that it has hardly ever been in reality, in spite of being based upon real events. When Day Breaks offers in almost dry historiographic moment the story viewed in Laga Zemlja in Belgrade, with a sort of politicized atonement in the end. The Holocaust story is widened to stand for contemporary atrocities and wars by the fictional melodramatic hero in search of true Jewish identity. Third Half contemplates the construction of contemporary Macedonian national identity under constant pressure of belligerent neighbors. It is based upon recorded testimony of the survivor, but hardly mentions the horrible destiny, Netha Cohen escaped, of 7,000 Macedonian Jews who died in Treblinka. Lea and Daria breaks the shameful silence by nostalgia story of mutual misunderstanding, forgetting and remembrance that save us all. B92 again offered two-part docudrama All Fair Ground, story of the camp. In World War II revisionist TV series Ravna Gora about Chetnik's movement and the Chetnik's version of the World War II, in episode 6, Drina, one of the subplots features arrest of Jewish merchant Julius and the documentary footage of Jews being transported to the camps. About Smell of the Rain in the Balkans and the End of the Day of the Balkans, you've heard a lot from Hans Jürgens. So, the effects or the models of reception could be summarized as very briefly. 1986 supported the increasing visibility of the Shoah pushed on the margins of the World War II history in Yugoslavia. 1990, the historical parallels initiate various attempts in multidirectional memory. In Serbia, not only that, it was the tagline of the War and Remembrance. The beginning of the end of war lies in the remembrance. In Serbia, it became the beginning of the end of war, and the beginning of the war itself lie in war and remembrance. 2005-2006, the transformation from the neutral narrative of death, just one among the variety of the stories of the socialist revolution, to the Hollywoodized narrative of survival. And that moment of the narrative transformation is comparable to the moment of the transformation of the Serbian mythomoteur. I refer to mythomoteur as Anthony Smith. It's a mythical narrative that is, in a way stands for the essence of the national historical existence. For a long time in Serbia, it was the myth of Kosovo, marked as a narrative of death. Since 1914, especially at the moment when we are commemorating the beginning of the First World War and the beginning of the European integration way of Serbia, that mythomoteur of death is replaced by the mythomoteur of survival and life. So that transformation influences the local production about Holocaust proliferating in the new millennium. In fact, the transformation of mythomoteur is echoed and is both supported by that transformation of the Holocaust text made in Serbia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we come to the last lecture of this morning session. Jonathan Friedman, director of Holocaust and Genocide Studies and professor of history at Westchester University in Pennsylvania. Professor Friedman, we are, by the way, very glad we have in our well-assorted library of the Wiesenthal Institute, we have also your book, The Routledge History of the Holocaust. Obviously, we are unable to have all your publications, but in the case you might remember that next year we will move to much bigger place so that we will have even more growing library. We will obviously appreciate if you let us know your publications. You can send it to us, or we'll obviously buy them. So, Professor Friedman, please.
Ich danke Ihnen für die Gelegenheit, an dieser wichtigen Konferenz teilzunehmen. Es gibt nicht so viele Gelegenheiten, Deutsch zu sprechen in den USA, so tonally and in terms of content, this paper is going to be quite different from the previous three, because we'll be dealing with comedy and satire. In 2004, Larry David's HBO comedy series, Curb Your Enthusiasm, I don't know if anyone here is familiar with that, but it is hugely popular in the United States. This episode aired a particular episode entitled The Survivor, which featured two storylines, one about Hasidic Judaism and one about the Holocaust. The first storyline has David, who plays either a fictitiously offensive or offensively real version of himself, contemplating an affair with a Hasidic female friend, complete with jaw-dropping jokes about Hasidic notions of sex. The second subplot unfolds at a dinner in which a Holocaust survivor and a former contestant on the reality show Survivor square off in an escalating war of words. In his writing for the comedy show Seinfeld, David created a world that had Jewish coding, but overt references to Jews and Jewish history were more oblique, the Soup Nazi and Schindler's List episodes aside. In Curb Your Enthusiasm, David's follow-up show about nothing, David frequently launches frontal assaults on everything Jewish, and many viewers found the Survivor episode well beyond the pale. This paper investigates this particular episode as a case study to evaluate the broader issue of representing the Holocaust through the medium of comedy, in this case, comedic television. In his 1987 review of a number of comedic and semi-comedic works about the Holocaust, scholar Terence Dupre took issue with what he saw as the limits set on Holocaust representation. That is to say that it should be approached as a sacred, unique event, and that depictions of it should be as accurate and faithful as possible to the facts and conditions of the event, without any change or manipulation for any reason. He argued in defense of humor and satire, declaring that, quote, "the value of the comic approach is that by setting things at a distance, it permits us a tougher, more active response," end quote. Proceeding from Dupre's assessment and employing the theories of Israeli psychologist Abner Ziv and historian Chaya Ostrower, I will assess what David's humor in his Survivor episode might actually be contesting. Ziv has posited 5 functions of humor. There's an aggressive function stemming from a sense of either frustration or superiority, a sexual function, a social function, a defense mechanism, specifically gallows humor and self-humor, and an intellectual function. While Ostrower demonstrated in her research that Holocaust survivors frequently utilized humor as a defense mechanism, I would argue that David, who is not a Holocaust survivor and operates in an entirely different universe, that of contemporary Hollywood, employs a more problematic form of aggressive humor. Specifically in the episode in question, he zeroes in on the subject of what constitutes a victim. The questions for this paper, therefore, are: does skewering victimization constitute an illegitimate assault? What constructive effort could such satire possibly bring? Are there criteria for distinguishing a successful from unsuccessful satire of this type? And if so, what are they? There are a number of feature film comedies about Nazi Germany and even the Holocaust, including The Great Dictator, To Be or Not to Be, even The Producers, Life is Beautiful, Inglourious Bastards, and Jacob the Liar. What distinguishes a classic, though, from The Great Dictator from a failure like Jacob the Liar is not easy to discern, and Dupre, for his part, did not lay out criteria for the effective use of comedy in ventilating Holocaust narratives. In fact, he seemed to qualify his approval in his conclusion, saying that the novels he was considering were basically serious, but they had some comedic content. They recognized first and foremost the gravity of the universe into which they were venturing. Films like Life is Beautiful and Jacob the Liar both do that, while Inglourious Bastards does not. So why do critics generally regard the first and third films as good while rejecting the second? In fact, of the 3, Jacob the Liar is perhaps the most earnest and desirous to achieve verisimilitude, and it ends on a more depressing note than either Life is Beautiful or Inglourious Bastards. I think a comparison of the original German version of Jacob the Liar, Jakob der Lügner, from 1975 is apt here, suggesting that it is not necessarily the genre of comedy that is the problem, but the way in which a particular story is constructed within the framework of that genre. Peter Stack, writing in 1999 for the San Francisco Chronicle, in advance of a limited run of the East German film, argued that the beauty of the film is its simplicity. There's no mugging for comedic effect. There's no pat jokes. There's no elaborate fantasies. Slowly, the vice of history closes in on this decent, innocent man, and the viewer is simply left speechless. The bottom line is, obviously, the Robin Williams version was simply a bad film. Comedy can therefore work as a means of representing the Holocaust, but because of the dangers it poses to the seriousness of the subject, producers should proceed with caution. They should at the very least come equipped with an excellent screenplay, acting, cinematography, and directing. And the one semi-comedic work with a Holocaust story I would argue falls into this category is 2005's Everything is Illuminated, based on the novel by Jonathan Safran Foer, which follows a fictional journey to Ukraine by Foer in search of a woman who, in this alternative universe, saved his grandfather during the German occupation. The comedy of the film, which underscores the cultural clash between an American Jew and his Ukrainian travel guides, allows the audience to acclimate itself to what is unfamiliar geography. The comedy also recedes once the complex details about Fur's grandfather and the secret identity of his elder Ukrainian guide unfold. Thus, the comedic elements serve more as commentary, not only about two peoples who know next to nothing about each other, but also on the absurdity of contemporary life in the wake of World War II. The movie and novel are more about the present and remembering the past in a region of the world little known to most Americans and still insufficiently explored in Anglo-American scholarship. Some critics might take issue with how comic films have represented Nazi Germany in the Holocaust, but with television, voices of criticism could be and have been more severe, given the place of television as a commodity in the modern home. While filmmakers make films with the hope of reaping some financial gain, films, can be more easily constructed as performing art, given that they are exhibited in public spaces that are often indistinguishable from the theater. Television, by contrast, is a medium of the private sphere, an ingredient of the commodification of home life since the 1950s. Therefore, although the Holocaust has appeared as a theme in television since that time, when it has had to coexist with marketing, an uncomfortable reality that was most evident during the 1978 miniseries, taken to task by critics because of the products advertised in its many commercial breaks. TV dramas dealing with the Holocaust have fared better since that time, most notably 1988's War and Remembrance, but the intersection of television, the Holocaust, and comedy remains largely avoided and toxic territory, except for Larry David. In the very first episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, David's character, Larry, the retired ex-producer of Seinfeld, finds himself in trouble by referring to his wife Cheryl as Hitler in a conversation that is overheard by friends who had a relative who was a Holocaust survivor. Depending on one's perspective as a viewer, it was either downhill or inspirational from there. In the series and its 80 episodes from 2000 to 2011, audiences were witness to vignette after vignette attesting to Larry David's idiocy. The Survivor episode from season 4 is squarely in this orbit. The intersecting storylines about the Holocaust and Larry's nearly consummated affair with a Hasidic laundrywoman, Anna, played by Gina Gershon, attempt to lay bare underlying hypocrisies and mythologies, and the former subplot is somewhat effective, but the construction of Jewishness in the characters problematizes David's satire. Both Anna and the rabbi bear little resemblance to any Hasidic woman or proper spiritual leader in reality. Even if David's intention were to poke fun at what Jews don't know about Hasidism, his construction of Anna would still be outrageous. For instance, although Anna wears a head covering, shown here, she smokes, she leaves her shirts unbuttoned to reveal cleavage, and is aggressively flirtatious with Larry, suggesting at one point that while her husband is at shul, she and Larry should have sex. David tackles the requisite urban legend about how Hasids have sex, allegedly through a hole in a sheet, and although he has Anna point out Larry's stupidity when he wraps himself up in said sheet at their hotel room, David has her spout off more profanity than many secular Jews would probably ever use. The rabbi, meanwhile, not only gives Larry approval for the affair, because Larry's wife was giving him a one-time sexual encounter as a 10th anniversary gift, which no respectable rabbi would ever do, but he also fuels the Holocaust storyline by asking Larry if he could bring a survivor to the rehearsal dinner for Larry and Cheryl's renewal of vows. The person whom the rabbi brings, Colby, played by Colby Donaldson, is clearly not a Holocaust survivor or a survivor in any sense of the word. But he was on the TV show Survivor. And the rabbi deliberately confuses the survival issue by asking, after Larry asks the rabbi about a photo on the rabbi's desk. And the rabbi says that it was his brother-in-law who died on September 11th, 2001, 9/11. As Larry asks him about where he was at Ground Zero, the rabbi explains that his brother-in-law died uptown on 57th Street, run over by a bike messenger. So the rabbi is both questionable in his morality and even more patently clueless than Larry, if that were possible. The humor in these instances, sexual and social, may be funny, but it reinforces negative images of Judaism. In fact, I would argue these images threaten to overshadow David's more valuable lampooning of what it means to be a survivor in contemporary American discourse. Because the rabbi asks to bring a survivor to the dinner, and Larry assumes he meant a Holocaust survivor, and why wouldn't he? Larry feels compelled to have his father invite his friend Solly, who Larry knows is also a Holocaust survivor. So David sets up a classic comic scenario based on character misunderstanding, and he plays it to the hilt. I would have shown the clip, but I'll just describe it here. At the dinner, Colby begins by describing the snakes he had to fend off in the Australian outback. And Solly, who's over there in the corner, responds, "That's a very interesting story. Let me tell you, I was in a concentration camp. You never even suffered 1 minute your whole life compared to what I went through." Colby then starts the downward spiral into comedy oblivion by responding, "Look, I'm saying we spent 42 days to survive. We had very little rations. We had no snacks," to which Solly rejoins, "Snacks? What are you talking about, snacks? We didn't eat sometimes for a week, for a month." Colby continues, "I couldn't even work out over there. They certainly didn't have a gym. I wore my sneakers out. The next thing I know, I have a pair of flip-flops. Have you ever even seen the show?" Solly shouts back, "Did you ever see our show? It was called The Holocaust. You don't know anything about survival. I'm a survivor." The two then start screaming back and forth, "I'm a survivor," until Solly hits his plate and splashes food on Larry's face and suit, prompting a non sequitur from Larry's mother-in-law, "Somebody get a sponge." Larry's befuddled response, ending the scene to the disgust of everyone, is, "I'm sorry, why don't you get a sponge?" "What? I just told her to get a sponge." In order to make amends, Larry invites Solly to his renewal of vows. But in the car, Solly's glass eye reflects into Larry's face, and Larry's arm movements lead Solly to believe that he's making fun of him. So he gets mad and bumps Cheryl, who spills wine on Larry's suit, freshly cleaned after the dinner incident. Solly demands to get out of the car, and he washes his hands of the whole pathetic lot. So here, David clearly does not intend to poke fun at the victim, but rather himself. And so while the bulk of the humor in the survivor storyline would fall into Ostrorer's aggressive category, it's done from a position of frustration and self-skewering. Even at the episode's climactic scene, the renewal of vows, Larry is incapable of anything redeemable to say. His vows are an incomprehensible mess. And then when Larry steps on the glass in the custom of Jewish weddings, he does so too quickly before the rabbi is able to move his hand away, resulting in a bloody hand injury and a screaming rabbi. The final scene of this episode, in which Anna chides Larry about the sheet, brings the deus ex machina of an earthquake, forcing the two almost lovebirds out into the parking lot of their room at the St. Regis Hotel, still wrapped up in their bed sheets. There they see Colby, who is also coincidentally staying at the hotel, and he has the last words of the show, quoting, "Larry, hey, we survived." Ultimately, it is not the Holocaust that David is satirizing, and he certainly is not mocking Holocaust survivors, but rather what journalist Stephen Vieder dubs a culture of victimhood that conflates real tragedy and survival with things that no one in their right mind would ever see as tragic or in the realm of suffering. David's brand of aggressive and self-humor therefore serves as dual criticism, both of collective and individual bad behavior. Everyone is either a schlemiel or a schlemazel in David's world, and this amplifies the satire. Although, once again, the downside is that it has the effect of reifying abstractions of Jews as generally horrible people. So in answering the question which I posed at the beginning, are there any effective criteria for comedy and in ventilating Holocaust narratives? This is an overriding qualification. Calling out people who think they are victims when they really are not, calling out double standards and insensitivity, all of which David skillfully does, are legitimate and necessary in preserving respect for real tragedy and trauma. Criteria for distinguishing successful from unsuccessful Holocaust satire on television might be too subjective to be of any consistent or systematic use. But taking an unspoken perception of some behavior and putting it out there in such a ridiculous way to make us realize how awful we're behaving is one possible avenue. David makes himself the butt of the joke throughout his series, but the question remains, does he have to do that to all of his other Jewish characters as well? In fairness, he is an equal opportunity misanthrope when it comes to Gentiles and other minorities. Again, to play on collective anxieties and to uncover latent and overt prejudices. Less incendiary Jewish imagery, however, I would argue, might actually help David deconstruct the assumptions of a culture of both revered and trivialized suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have been perfect. 20 minutes and very interesting stuff. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, due to the admirable discipline of all our colleagues this morning, we are in the fortunate situation that we have now plenty of time for an interesting discussion. Just a moment. And this discussion has to finish about 12:30. So please, first, yes?
I thank you for the panelists for these great presentations. I have a question for Yael and a comment maybe for Jan. I didn't know the documentary that you were talking about, and it looks really fascinating, so I really want to see it. And I was wondering, you talked about these multi-layers and these voices, the different voices that are added to the footage, you could say, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the other sounds, because I mean there is music that maybe adds to this other planet, I don't know, and also this additional sound with the, you know, the baskets with the bricks, and you have really this Atmo sound that is added. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And about This Is Your Life, I think it's really convincing how you compare these the show from the 50s and the testimonies that we know, for example, from the Shoah Foundation. I think it's also very convincing how you talk about the narration and the structure and everything. So I think there is something to it, but I believe that it's more complicated or more complex than you presented it, because I would say there is, for example, you talked about the living room situation, and I would say, well, there is a totally difference if you are in a television studio and the podium is shaped like a living room, which is, of course, not the living room of the survivor or of the person that is in the spot, you could say. And I would also relate it to the let's say what a medium is. I mean, television is a domestic medium, and in a lot of these shows in the 50s, we have a living room. So I would rather try to connect this setting to television history, and to this idea is, you know, if you present something on television, it has to mirror in a way the situation how people watch television. So I think there's a difference, because in the testimonies of the Shoah Foundation, we see the survivors in their own living room, so there's a difference. And the other aspect I was wondering is, I think it's really convincing that you talk about that people or survivors make meaning and they tell a coherent story, which is true. And I think this has a lot to do with other media testimonies. So as a survivor, you are used to how you talk about or how you present, you would say, your life story. But in the sense, in the example that you showed us or you described, you talked about that there is this survivor who is not able to tell a coherent story, and we need an anchorman to make a coherent story of it. So I'm wondering if it's not a bit more complex, and that we could say, well, the survivors now have internalized this coherent story, but in the 50s this was not the case. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like?
I'll begin. Okay, about the sound, as I say, the film was found without any soundtrack. So the director, Yael, had the possibility to choose whatever she wanted. She could have added music, she could have one soundtrack, a diary of one of the people who do not live anymore. She could have chosen the voices of the survivors who comment on what they have. But instead of this, she chose to make a multi-layered soundtrack, which is both, it has music, and it was added, of course, it was a music composed specifically for this film. It has diaries, letters, it has testimonies. All these things together create a feeling of something very complex. And I think it's one of the questions which was raised here all the time, which is a question of truth. Is there a way to get through this mixture to get some kind of truth, to find out some kind of truth? And I think that the mixing of the soundtracks is an attempt to reach some kind of truth, or at least saying that the truth is so complex we'll never get to an end. But I think this was the effort. But on the other hand, my critique is, as I said, first of all, that the survivors do not have names in the film, which I think it's a shame. It's just personal opinion. You know, they're just here to comment some things they have seen, but they are like not non-important people. And the second thing is that in this effort to put all this information, it makes the film very difficult to follow. Apparently, she, don't know for sure, but she had a limitation of time. She could not make a film run like, Shoah endlessly. A very long film. She was limited in the duration of her film, and therefore she had to put all this information together. The result is that the different soundtracks correspond with each other and create new meanings. And some of these meanings are intended because she has been editing the film for a very long time. She had so much visual, so many soundtracks. But some of the meanings are, I think, more problematic. Because they were not intended, and they are created by the attempt to put everything together. That's it.
I think you're totally right that in the 1950s there was no coherent narrative that survivors could rely on. So if I Herzberg's comment is almost, it reminds me a little bit of what Kirby in The Survivor says. So, for example, when she tries to explain what she suffered through in Auschwitz, she talks about the dress she had to wear, and she also talks about that she had to share a bed with others. So this is kind of incomprehensible for the audience, I think, and that's why Edwards steps in. So this leads kind of to my argument that in this case the TV show created the frame, and that later on the oral history archives kind of created the frame. And like one very important mechanism to assure a certain narrative are these pre-interview questionnaires that kind of like show the survivors what they are expected to tell. So this is my argument. And to the living room, I think it's so. Of course, it is television history. So for me, it kind of shows that these visual history archives that they are in a very, very tight connection to television. The Fortune Video Archive at Yale was founded as a counter-reaction to television, but it still uses many, many themes of television. And the Shoah Foundation itself, it not comes out of television, but out of film, out of Schindler's List. So there is always this connection, and I think the living room scenery kind of like symbolizes this relation. And I mean, not all interviews look like the interview of Leslie Eichner that I've shown, but you have in many Shoah Foundation interviews like these, you have like pictures in the back, you have heavy curtains, you have the flower arrangement, so it's kind of like this bourgeois, upper middle class living room, which of course is also like kind of a fiction, because not all survivors were that or are that well off, but it kind of like is this like symbol of American survivors.
Thank you. Professor Kahnstein.
Fantastic panel. I can hardly curb my enthusiasm, because I mean, I think what is beautiful about the panel is that it brings us back to the beginning of the paradigm, how it developed, how it was not shaped yet, and it brings us to the end, where television at its best becomes very self-reflexive, which we often don't notice any longer, because we find ourselves confronted with a very homogeneous and very well-established story. So in that sense, I think the panel gives a fantastic opportunity to historicize television, to look at the larger developments, and to then, you know, discuss how successful or what kind of failures self-reflexive television has. So in that sense, I'm really enthusiastic. Now, maybe a few precise remarks to the respective papers. It's already said. I think you're absolutely right in pairing again the question of narrative and television. It makes perfect sense to me. I think your representation is very compelling. But indeed, whenever we use structuralist terminology and tools, we tend to dehistoricize. And I think one has to rehistoricize this. So I think one has to realize that, but you're looking at this not yet in existence paradigm, that we are, when it comes, for example, to the survivor, we are actually facing a situation of violence. I mean, that is an almost abusive situation that is being played out here. Whereas the very same paradigm, as it's well established, becomes a paradigm of comfort, including a paradigm of comfort for the survivors. So in that sense, you very nicely look at the beginning and look at the end and put these two together. But I think at some point you want to, which you might do in other occasions, you want to, so to speak, cover the distance between the two. And I think that's a very, very compelling engagement. I'm jumping to, because you're sitting right next to the question of the Israeli, these very interesting, you know, this is also what television has become, a very much a transnational medium, where you, I think, very accurately point out how much television is now crafted in these kinds of transnational corporations, and how money flows is very important. And the pronounced cooperations between German television and Israeli television I find also very interesting. My reading of the films are slightly different, and I think different readings can easily coexist here, because especially in Unfinished, film Unfinished is a very complex layering of codes. I see the film much more, for my taste, so to speak, and that's a subjective assessment. For my taste, the film is a very smart engagement with an overwhelming, and by the author very negatively perceived interpretation of Holocaust memory in Israel. So I think, and this link, I will link this also to your case, to Larry, to curb your enthusiasm. I think a film Unfinished is an attempt to break up a paradigm that has now become somewhat oppressive. That is, you know, the type of official memory that Israel has created. And I think Herzonsky does it in a very ad hoc, you're right, you know, the film was produced quickly, ad hoc way, but she does it, I think, in a quite compelling way to so to speak, move away from the sentimentality, move away from the piousness, move away also from creating these images that can be so easily politically instrumentalized, and try to create something that is complex and that is cannot be so easily instrumentalized. And you're right, in that sense, one could say, you know, as you probably said, the violence might disappear. One could suggest, I realize it now that you have shown it, that maybe the way she treated the survivors is indeed very problematic. I really like the way you raised that question. So I don't know, but I, so to speak, respond positively to this deconstructive effort of trying to create here something with international funding that shows a more complete picture. You know, and again, I mean, I think Curb Your Enthusiasm, of course, is fantastically controversial. But what it does so beautifully is to deconstruct the piousness of American Jewish identity as it revels in the Holocaust, right? And who else can do that but precisely this person? So in that sense, yeah, I can easily see that people are very offended by it, but for me this is television, as I said, at its best. This is memory politics in television at its best because it has this edge, this self-critical edge. That's what I'm always looking for. That's what I find so intriguing. Now, maybe one question of just comprehension, because I have to admit, your paper was so fast, I didn't catch some of the nuances. And so I'm still wondering, I have always been intrigued by this layering. I mean, Serbia is the one place that is very different from many other places at the moment, because you have these layerings of human rights violation, you know, layered right on top of Holocaust and, you know, simultaneously. So again, it's a fantastic, you know, way to study and try to make sense of. What I haven't quite understood from your intervention is, do you think that there is a potentially positive element in this layering and there is a self-reflexive potential, or do you think that this simply doesn't make any sense to bring these two things together at the moment? Here I'm not quite sure if I understood your argument in its details. But thank you again for very good interventions.
Answer? Yes, I cannot give you any definite answer. I completely agree with you. It really depends from which perspective you're looking from. If you're looking from the perspective of a very closed and very divided, fractioned Jewish community, that is something that doesn't make sense at all, because they are quite traditional and they want to preserve, for example, Old Fairground as a unique space of the Holocaust, of Judenlagersammlung episode. If you're looking from the perspective of so-called contemporary Serbia, either in Milošević's time or in time of Boris Tadić, or again in time of Aleksandar Vučić, as a sort of relapse or a suspended time between Milošević and Tadić, we have a very complicated, non-linear political history, I would say. It doesn't make any sense at all, because unless on a global level that we are trying to change the image that Serbia permanently holds in the eyes of the European public opinion, that we are predominant, if not the sole responsible and guilty party for the breakup of former Yugoslavia. And at that point, what part of Serbia did is that, in spite of their very neutral relation toward Jewish population, they in fact try to manipulate and to profit from the identification, both spontaneous and intentional one, with the strong parallels, historical parallels between Serbs and Jews in general. For example, one of the crucial arguments is not solely the fact that during the Second World War, Jews, Gypsies, and Serbs were persecuted and sent to concentration camps, both in Germany, Austria, and in Croatia, but also by the contemporary fact that Serbs are the nation whose holiest and sacred places are on the territory of the others. So, as you have divided Jerusalem, most of the Serbian monasteries, Pećka Patriarchate and so on, are on the territory of Kosovo. And you cannot say that Kosovo is an independent state. You just have to say it's on the territory of so-called others within Serbia, but that's a global politics, I would say. So it really makes and doesn't make sense at all, but it's very useful as a political territory where you can nuance the truth and make parallels and so on. I didn't talk on purpose about political parallels. We were talking about that in terms of multidirectional memory. At a certain point, the memory of the Holocaust becomes the point of the ramification of memory, bifurcation of memory that also connects with the Serbian national memory and past. And that's, in that sense, I would say that parallel of transformation of mythomoteur, it's really a very close one as to the Holocaust. We took the patterns of the commercialization of the Holocaust to commercialize Serbian past, so to say. Would you like to jump?
Yeah, I would also like to react on Professor Kahnsteiner's remarks. I think so. There are much more self-reflexive television shows that kind of deal with its own role in creating the figure of the survivor. So, for example, the Sarah Silverman program does show in one episode. There's this one film, the Memory Thief, that was shown on television, and like it goes back to the 80s. The movie, the television movie Skopje does it, and even a CSI New York episode is very self-reflexive with its own role in like kind of creating the survivor figure. Coming back to This Is Your Life, I agree that from a today's perspective, it is extremely abusive to watch how Hannah Bloch-Kona is treated. But she didn't feel violated, I think, and I think you can see that by looking at her later reactions on her past. For example, she publishes together with her husband a autobiography, and her autobiography is also like constructed. It's narrated in the same way than the show, than the TV show. So there's also the love story is at the center of her autobiography, and it was published in the 80s. So after the miniseries, when like Holocaust memory became a much bigger thing. So she's not kind of distancing herself from how she was treated later on.
I want to say something. Say something?
Yes, please.
About the international funding of Israeli cinema. When I speak about international funds, I refer especially to documentaries. Also, feature films are also receive also funds, but it's mainly documentaries. And money is received from France and from Germany, mostly from Germany, less from France, but. It has a certain impact on the films. As I said, the producers have the right to introduce certain shifts. The other film I mentioned in my lecture, which I didn't show, The Flat by Arnon Goldfinger, who is also a brilliant documentary, has been such a great success. Someone saw it? No one? Hey, you. It was a great success, and it was a great success in Germany. And recently, like 2 months ago, Arnon sent a mail saying that his film has been watched by 1 million people in Germany, which is quite something, quite an achievement. You know, it's a documentary about Israeli identity. And I think that all these things shape the form of the documentary. The producer has a right to say, no, don't go into this issue, it's not relevant. Or, you know, you can go deeper in something. And it makes a serious change compared to previous documentaries. We have to remember that Israeli documentaries in the past were very ignored, either on the Shoah or not on the Shoah. Israeli cinema in general was not a big issue in the world. And now it's becoming. So it has to do with international funding and the influence. That's it.
just ask you a question? I couldn't help but the last documentary, I'm the Final, or whatever, reminded me of Agnieszka Holland in the Dark. The very scenes of embellishing in front of the mirror and the camera pans and see them in the bed and so on. Is it a coincidence, or there is some ground for my...
No, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but Agnieszka Holland is a film that was staged. This is a film about the making of a film, which is the footage was found with no soundtrack, and the filmmaker could organize it the way she wanted. But so I don't think it has any connection. And Agnieszka Holland didn't know this film because it was revealed only now. Yes. So.
It's a fabulous panel. I could spend a year studying all your papers. So I have a bunch of questions that we'll see who can answer them. Maybe it comes down to something to ask Professor Munk and Friedman. First of all, the mention of re-traumatizing the victim, I call it reperpetrating. And it's not just the movies, because just with Hannah Block-Kohner, we sit here in this age and say that she was manipulated. I'm not sure if she was, which you just said. Maybe that's how she wanted to be portrayed. So if we don't like how she's portrayed, maybe we're reperpetrating her wish to be a successful, beautiful Hollywood wife. But the deeper questions, one is Professor Kunsteiner mentioned about rehistoricizing. And the question is, rehistoricizing, does that conflict with historicity? And then comes the larger questions. Do films contribute to the cultural narratives, or does the cultured narrative dictate the film? All of you have more or less talked about that. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference between the Jewish narrative and the non-Jewish narrative? And then what this panel really developed is the geographic location of the narrative. And so finally comes the question, when Professor Munk, you talk about the Israel narrative, which is made up of a triad of Zionism, existential threat, and Holocaust, where, and I think you just mentioned, the U.S. Jewish narrative or culture now is mostly shaped by the Holocaust, has moved away from, in the 80s and 70s, being Zionist-friendly. So what is, I guess it boils down to, at least between Israel and U.S. Jewish culture, because you also, Professor Friedman, were describing what today's Jewish culture maybe is exposed to or shaped by. So anybody can answer any of those.
I'll begin. I'll just say something very general. In Israel, we have this concept about the new Jew, which is a Jew which was born after Zionism. It's a Jew which was not contaminated by the Holocaust. He kind of escaped his fate. And the new Jew, it was a paradigm for a very long time. It was the story of Israel. And if you were not a new Jew, either you came from other places, like Russia, North Africa, or whatever, or you came from the Holocaust, you were a survivor, you were not part of the country. And I think that what I tried to say, that especially speaking about the flat, but not only, that there is a shift about looking at the Holocaust. It's not anymore interested documentarist gaze. It's much more an attempt to integrate it into Israeli identity. And as you all know, Israeli identity is something very not stable. It's moving all the time. So it's an attempt to integrate these different phases of Jewishness, the Holocaust being one of them, into Israeli identity. And in here, it relates to what you spoke about, this multi-layered, multi-directional memory. I think there is more and more work being done in Israel about multi-directional memory as the narratives come together. And when people speak about the Holocaust, they know that it's one part. So we don't have the monopoly on the Holocaust, although we suffered a lot. A lot. That's it.
I think for me, I'm actually more conflicted about the Larry David episode than Professor Kunsteiner. I think that both in terms of film and television, I see the representation of the Holocaust from U.S. production companies is stagnating, and So when you have Inglourious Bastards and episodes like The Survivor and poorly made films like Esther's Diary, and that's where we're at in terms of cinematic and television representation. I think that it's more challenging and depressing because there are so many more stories that are actually out there that reflect the nuance and the diversity of experience and Jewish identity. And if what we're left with is Larry David's commentary, and I appreciate what he's doing, and it is funny. But if that's what we're left with, if that's the place where we're at in U.S. popular culture, then I'm not really comfortable with that. I worked at the Shoah Foundation. I worked at the Holocaust Museum. I know the thousands of other stories that are out there that really should be represented, and could be represented in ways that are dramatic, could be represented in ways that are comedic, and that would be more effective. And so that, I think the motivation for me to write this piece and describe it was more out of a place of frustration about the lack of recognition about the great spectrum of Jewish identity and the great spectrum of experience in terms of the Holocaust. And so that it was less from a position of, boy, this is great deconstruction going on, and more out of concern, really.
I found Mr. Taubitz's presentation very interesting because there is one side to this, how society is reacting to survivors. I'm myself a survivor, and I have the experience, I can only speak about Austria. As far as Austrian media is concerned, they are primarily interested to show that the survivor has made it in the end, that he has an apartment. For instance, when the Austrian television wanted to do an interview with me or wanted to show my story, they insisted to do it in my apartment and not in the asylum of the city of Vienna, where Hitler started where Hitler was living, in the same asylum where I started my life in Austria with 49 alcoholics and former criminals. So this is what society expects you to do, to show that you are successful, that after all, the story ends with a happy end. And I can tell you another story which has nothing to do with television, but which has to do very much with the expectation of political correctness and of Austria, how it is functioning. I was asked to allow anthology of what can happen only in Vienna, into this anthology, the story of my returning to Austria, which I describe now. And I gave it. And I met, on the way to the presentation, I met the editor. And I told her, when I looked now at the anthology, I saw only people who had success in life, who became journalists like myself, or writers, or whatever. They had success. And I met so many people who were broken by this experience, and I want to say a word about it. You know what the result was? The result was that the lady of the lady of the edition company came to me, and I was supposed to read my story, and she said, "Mr. Pfeiffer, you are not offended, but you know we have so many We have so many stories, so you don't read your story. I said, of course, I'm not offended. And then they brought this story of an American professor, very left-wing also, which is quite good for this story. And he came to Austria, and he's teaching at Vienna University. And his big story about Austria was that he rented an apartment, and on the Mistkübel, how do you say it? On the trash can, somebody put a Hakenkreuz, an arrow, a swastika. And that was a big story. And then the lady came again to me and said, please, could you read your story, but without anything saying before the story? And this is really the problem. So, I mean, this is how I see the problem. One should show reality as it is and not put cosmetics, you know, and show Austria as a wonderful, happy country. But of course, I'm doing already what I should have done tomorrow. Okay, that's it.
Mr. Pfeiffer, thank you very much for your personal experience. Is there anybody else who would like to join the enthusiasm for this morning session? Come on.
That's okay.
We still have... No, hold on. Lunch is not... Yes, please. Mr. Rauch?
A very basal question to Mr. Friedman. I wasn't sure if you were criticizing or in favor of Inglourious Basterds. I think it's a fascinating movie. Maybe you can make your point clearer to me.
I'm not a fan of the movie. Again, this is obviously a very subjective enterprise, but turning Jews into butchers, I mean, that did not have any appeal to me. I didn't need to see that, so I didn't find it effective. And again, because I'm coming from a perspective of having worked in oral history and at the Holocaust Museum and the Shoah Foundation, having seen hundreds of testimonies, having been emotionally devastated by so many narratives that I had never even thought I could explore, and so to have Inglourious Basterds as one of the most recent, if not one of the latest, or hopefully not the last word on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust by an American film production company, that's just unacceptable to me. And to say that, well, what is there left to do? Hasn't that road been sufficiently applauded? I don't find that acceptable. I think that there are so many other. I mean, why don't we have an autobiography of Simon Srebnik, one of the only survivors of Helmlo? What about Rolf Raeder of Belgitz? I mean, there's so many other amazingly compelling stories. Dina Beitler, one of the few survivors of mass shooting experiences in Latvia. I mean, these are testimonies that I bring into my classes to personalize what has become an abstraction, and they're devastating, and they actually reinforce the learning, and so when I'm not a real fan of the postmodern. Everything has to be deconstructed, and I can appreciate it, but I think that it is taken it's to such an extreme now that I can't really find much effectiveness in films like Inglourious Basterds. I think that Europe and Israel are places now where there is more exciting representations. I think the film In Darkness, the Polish film In Darkness, I don't know if you've seen that, about the Polish Oskar Schindler, who rescued Jews in the sewers of Lvov. That's an effective film. I think Pokvoji, the film Aftermath, is a really good film until the ending, and there was a film last year, Ida, about.
It raises many questions. This Ida film, many questions, because you don't like the postmodern, but it's on the edge of the postmodern.
Right.
Just remark. I didn't say anything.
No, they're equally as problematic.
Yeah.
But I think that the more dynamic scene has shifted from Hollywood to Europe and Israel.
Especially in France. There is a bunch of films.
La Rafla, Sarah's Key.
Le Secret de Miller.
Yeah.
Just a little comment you would like to know. Maybe in Germany, 3 films are one has been done now, and 2 other will be done about Fritz Bauer, the Fritz Bauer story. So you might be interested into that. 3 within 12 months.
You know, I like that observation that, so to speak, the subject matter seems to be more productively engaged in Europe. And I would say that makes perfect sense, because Holocaust memory never made much sense to me in the States to begin with, because it is a transplanted memory that has not even the potential of being self-critical. So in that sense, it served completely different purposes. And the purposes that Holocaust memory served in the States are not purposes I'm particularly happy with. I was one comment, one conceptual, which might help to understand some of these films. That was about post-memory. What I find so intriguing is that when we look at Marianne Hirsch's initial definition of post-memory, then it's very much applied to the second generation. Yes. She put the second generation in the pivot position, where the second generation is in the, so to speak, has proximity to trauma, and therefore can speak about trauma with a certain sense of information, of knowing, in a better sense than the traumatized people themselves, because they are speechless, or tend sometimes to be speechless, or have problems to find their speech and their voice. Makes perfect sense. But at the same time, the second generation has, so to speak, the ability to talk then to its peers or subsequent generation from a certain privileged position of knowledge, tacit knowledge, if you wish. One can criticize that or find it very an interesting description. That's not my point. My point is, what I find so interesting about the third generation movies that are coming out of Israel now, that they are often precisely not crafted from that specific vantage point. They are often crafted from a different one. So in that sense, there seems to be very interesting and also very creative and I think interesting tension, but also very creative type of recovery that is cast from a position of, for better or for worse, greater distance. And I think it is linked what you very accurately described as, in many ways, a lack of knowledge, lack of tradition. Again, for better or for worse. And it can be that distancing can also, in self-inquiry, can apparently be a very creative point of departure for an interesting multi-layered production.
And it's also, it has, sorry.
Post-memory work, isn't it also very specific to Jewish second generation versus the general public of multiple generations? That's where.
You're right, but of course one could, take it and apply it elsewhere if one wanted to. But you're right. Originally, of course, it is crafted that way. Yes.
What I wanted to say about the third generation, the second generation actually was not revealed to the narratives of the Holocaust because of the famous silence, a generation who didn't speak. So the third generation comes and combines bits and pieces of information, and most of it is invented in their own imaginary, what they've learned at school, what they read in books, what they saw in films, on television, and then the television comes with a very important role in the shaper of the memory. But I think that what is very interesting, and there is a name that I planned to talk about, but finally I decided not to, it's Yael Bartana. Do you know Yael Bartana? It's a Polish trilogy. Yael Bartana made a film about the return of the Jews to Poland. It's a video art composed of 3 parts, And it was financed by the Polish government, the Polish Ministry of Culture, and she represented Poland in the Biennale in Venice, an Israeli who represented Poland. And the story was that I don't know anything about the Holocaust, though I'm the child or the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. All I can do is imagine consequences, such as this chapter, these 3 chapters film about the return of Jews to Poland. And it was very, on the one hand, it's fascinating because you see this guy standing in an empty stadium calling in Polish, and my Polish does not exist, so I cannot repeat it. But Jews, come home, we're waiting for you. We want you to come home. And it's ironic, but at the same time, it's a wishful thinking, you know, for some of the from the Polish people, but Jews. But on the other hand, it also has a potential of reinventing history. We are in such a situation that we have all the visuals, and the narratives are becoming more and more blurred. So why not, actually? Why won't a leader, a Polish leader, stand in the middle of the stadium and say, "My dear Jews, come back, we're waiting for you"? It seems crazy, but it's very, very impressive. And this, she was, of course, criticized a lot in Israel about it, and she was very much applauded in the world because it was very impressive. But it's what's the potentiality of the Holocaust narrative? It has potential narratives coming out of it, and not all of them are kosher, so to speak.
We have last 2 questions. Mr. Pera, first, please.
A very quick question for Jonathan Friedman. I really enjoyed the paper. Only slightly concerned about the fact that it struck me as potentially being a bit normative in a way. The question is, what is the, in your theorizing of comedy and appropriate or less appropriate comedy, what is the place of subject position in this theorization? Who makes the jokes, and what is the recipient, what is the target audience of these jokes? Because I think that is something that is important in understanding and maybe assessing the whatever is the product that we're looking at. And second point is, one of the points that you made in the as a reply to one of the questions, is it fair to in a way fault the product for the fact that the rest of the kind of cultural environment around it is not doing is not producing other compelling products? For example, your point that arguing that your disapproval with the fact that we are left with Curb Your Enthusiasm, faulting that for the fact that the rest of American culture and culture industry is not producing other compelling stories. Is it, I don't know, is it fair? Am I making sense? And also, another point is in favor of this construction. Maybe when there's a paradigm that is so strong and maybe stifling, one needs that. And I'm thinking of the role played by, say, this episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, or something like what the Chamber Quintet did in Israel a few years ago, which was challenging the place of the Holocaust in a certain culture as a way of deconstructing that in order to make room for other stories. So, I don't know, I just want to wonder what you thought about that, if you had any thoughts. Thank you.
So there's a lot to unpack there. I think that certainly knowing the target audience is important, and not attacking Holocaust survivors. I mean, that to me is beyond the pale. And David doesn't do that. He's got another, I think, more sophisticated purpose, and I get that. But the reality is that the 1990s were the peak of Hollywood productions on the Holocaust, and there was a noticeable decline in the past decade, as if the subject has been sufficiently explored. And I don't think that's the case. You did have the Seinfeld episodes in the 90s at a time that was, you did have the proliferation of both the Holocaust Museum and the Shoah Foundation, Schindler's List. That was the decade that saw the largest number of Hollywood productions on the Holocaust. So fine if you want to skewer that in the 90s, but why the drop off? And I think that's again, I go back to the original concern of mine, and that is it's not like there's a surfeit or an excess of Hollywood productions on the Holocaust, and yet what there seems to be is a mentality that the story has been done, and that we now just no rules because we have this somehow this pious paradigm that has to be shattered, and I just don't think that the story has been done, and I still think that where it's effective, where comedy is effective, is like a film. Everything is illuminated. If you've seen the film, where it's very comedic in the first half hour or 45 minutes, it's hysterical, and yet that the comedy allows the audience to acclimate, and then it recedes, and it is very effective. So you need a very sophisticated touch and a very delicate hand when you're going into comedy. And if you do something that's like Inglourious Basterds, which is just a blunt tool, you might win over some people, but for me it absolutely, utterly turned me off. So I think that finding the rules and realizing, okay, you have to have another more sophisticated purpose if you're going to use comedy, and you have to tread very, very carefully.
I would just like to make two comments. I would very much agree with what you just said, that the topic hasn't been covered or hasn't been done with, so to speak, in the American film industry, and the reasons for that would be very interesting to look into, because although I think it's kind of unfair to try to impose on one movie like Inglourious Basterds everything that's missing from the scene, because obviously this movie, the intent of this movie was not to fill in the gaps that are missing, but it has other intentions, which is, I think, to remove the sign of the victim from the Jews and make them into the heroes. So it's a kind of anti-story, which goes against the grain of history, which is psychologically motivated. But Professor Kahnsteiner just mentioned a while ago something that I would argue with. Namely that I think he said something along the lines of Americans do not have Holocaust memory because they were not involved. I'm sorry. Yeah, is that what you? As far as I understood what sorry, as far as I understood what you said, you said something that. That Americans don't have Holocaust memory because it's something that's handed down, and therefore it's an indirect.
Not quite.
Not quite. Because as far as I see it, that's not true. Americans, I think, quite obviously do have Holocaust memory, and actually that brings us to this very fierce debate that Schindler List. Caused after it was shown, because, for instance, even Nobel Prize winning writers like Imre Kertész said that Americans basically don't even have the right to address this whole problem or issue since they were not directly involved. Namely geographically and personally often, which I think is a quite absurd stance to take. And I think that it's also a mistake to expect the American memorialization in any way of the Holocaust to answer the same questions that the European memorialization tries to address, because it's a wholly different perspective from a wholly different historical background. So I wonder what you think about this. That it's not even unfair, but I think it's mistaken to expect the American movie industry or television or whichever other medium to address this problem in the same way that we expect it to be addressed in Europe, simply because of the fundamentally different perspective from which they are coming to the question.
By way of clarification, you're absolutely right. I think it's very important to emphasize that these are different memory cultures. They're operating from different points of view. And from my, again, very subjective position, what I'm lacking in US memory culture of the Holocaust, which of course exists very importantly, is a self-critical, self-reflexive moment, which might be linked to the subject matter, because the Holocaust is not a great place to think self-reflexively about American violence. In that sense, you know.
Yeah, actually, can I just add a very short footnote to this? Yes, please. We don't want that. But what was I going to say? I forgot. Yes, the fact that you said that hasn't been covered, and I think that the new territory is exactly what Professor Kahnsteiner said. The new possibilities for addressing the theme of the Holocaust in American, for instance, movie or television industry would be from a self-critical stance, would be to address certain topics that the American film industry has not or very minimally addressed, namely their own involvement in, for instance, allowing Nazi scientists to emigrate to the US after the war, and so on and so forth. Again, I mentioned the American eugenics movement, which was a very obvious precursor to Nazi race ideology. So I think that may be the non-covered territory towards which it perhaps could go, and which would be interesting. I don't know what you think about this.
No, I agree with that. I definitely think that that there's certainly more introspection, moving away from the heroic American redemptive narrative is necessary. My concern is that the human dimension still of the Holocaust for an American audience and for a world audience is still very much needed. And since Hollywood and American television are the media that can actually engage that, I mean, they're so worldwide and impactful in world culture that they have a responsibility to continue to show the human, the individual, the personal stories, without, I agree with you, the framework of American redemption. So I think that there's a space for both. That there's still the need for stories to be ventilated, and totally agree that there are more stories that need to challenge the American narrative, and so a film dealing with the horrors of the eugenics program, the sterilization program in the United States, absolutely should happen. Probably would never be greenlit by a mainstream American Hollywood studio.
That has been made about the the movement. In 2009, it even received several awards, but it's not available in any way. It cannot be seen, cannot be ordered. Yeah, well.
Is this Munk? Oh, okay. So we are going, if you allow me, to close this session. I would like to thank very much to the interesting contributions of all of you, and also to you for the interesting discussion remarks. Before we jump up and go to for lunch, let me just stress one thing. Today we are going to work until 5:30 p.m. And then, if you are interested, you are cordially invited to join us for the traditional Heurige at 6 o'clock, 6 p.m. in front of this building. A bus is waiting for you. And those who would like to join this evening spent with us, you are cordially invited. We go to a very nice, small, old Heurige. The second remark is, not as yesterday, we'll take our lunch not at the end, at the entrance of the building, but when you get out here from this place, you turn left and there is a studio number 2. And here you will find a nice lunch. Last remark, there are already some interesting articles appeared yesterday and today in First Austrian Broadcasting Company. I will leave a copy there on the table, an interview with Professor Kannsteiner, and today there is supposed an article to be published at Die Presse. And who doesn't want to drink any wine and join us to this evening, instead of that, watch Austrian television. So 10 to 8 p.m. You can see a little relation about our conference. And some of you gave some interviews, so I thank you for the cooperation. But now, guten Appetit. Please join us for lunch. Danke.